The Netherlands is on the edge of collapse. Amsterdam is now the most expensive city to rent in Europe, with 3 other major Dutch cities also ranking in the top 10. Just 20 years ago, you could purchase a home in Amsterdam for €225,000. Today, that figure is $647,000. That's over a 180% rise in just 2 decades. But Amsterdam isn't an outlier. Across the country, home prices have soared 120% on average, and the majority of those gains have happened in just the past decade. Unsurprisingly, the biggest increases have occurred in the Randstad region, a ring of major cities including Amsterdam, Rotterdam, The Hague, and Utrecht, which are all connected by suburbs and small towns. Altogether, the Randstad houses 8.1 million people, nearly half of the Netherlands' entire population. In the Randstad, even an above-average wage doesn't guarantee you a home. You would need to pay €452,000, more than 10 times the average salary, just to afford a typical one. Yet, despite this, the Netherlands as a whole is quite incredible. The public transport is exceptional. The infrastructure is mesmerizing, and the biking paths are incomparable to any other major city. But the reality is, the Netherlands was never designed to house this many people. And to understand how this crisis even started, we need to go back to a time when the country was forced to rebuild itself from scratch. By the end of World War II, large parts of the country's infrastructure had been destroyed after hundreds of bombing raids had been carried out during the German occupation. Rotterdam was hit the worst. In May 1940, German bombers destroyed 25,000 homes in one single day, wiping out nearly the entire historic city center. In 1945, a residential neighborhood in The Hague was mistakenly bombed by the British Royal Air Force. The attack destroyed nearly 3,300 homes and left 30,000 people homeless. By the end of the war, almost a quarter of all homes in the Netherlands had been damaged, leaving the country with a massive housing shortage. The government was left to face the enormous task of rebuilding the housing system, and solving it would require some major intervention. Housing associations, which had primarily existed to house industrial workers, were brought under strict government supervision. At a time when the scale of the crisis left little room for debate, the government was able to invest billions in public funding and began constructing hundreds of thousands of affordable homes across the country. For decades, the system worked remarkably well. Social housing became a key part of the Dutch welfare state, and although housing associations were technically independent, they operated largely as an extension of the state. During the post-war period, there were no income limits for social housing. Small business owners, young couples, and academics lived alongside industrial workers and carpenters. Regardless of their income, people could choose whether to live in social housing, rent privately, or buy a home. This resulted in the number of people living in social housing rising from just 13% before the war to 37% by 1975. But after the housing crisis was somewhat relieved, another problem began to emerge. The Netherlands was running out of land to build on. Historically, the Dutch have found ingenious ways of creating new land out of basically nothing. See, for centuries, the Dutch have been reclaiming land from the sea and marshlands to increase their territories. For example, Flevoland, a province of the Netherlands since 1986, was completely underwater before 1924. But through a highly sophisticated system of dikes, sand dunes, drainage canals, and mechanical pumps, which were originally powered by windmills and later by electricity, the Dutch gradually drained the seabed and created 2,400 square kilometers of new land. But why am I mentioning this? Well, while in the past the Netherlands was able to reclaim more land and therefore expand, that's no longer something worthwhile today. Climate change is causing new problems like rising sea levels, extreme storms triggering mass floods, and heat-driven droughts that destabilize reclaimed soil. In fact, around 59% of the land is prone to flooding, including 26% that lies below sea level. But not continuing to reclaim more land is also a problem, because it limits the amount of available and developable space. But what's also a problem is forgetting to subscribe, so make sure to. Anyways, as a result, land and housing prices keep going up, making the already extreme housing shortage problem even worse. Today, the Netherlands faces one of Europe's most severe land shortages, and with 18 million people living in just over 41,000 square kilometers, it makes it one of the most densely populated countries in the world. But even though there's no more room left to grow, more and more people keep coming. So while continuing to reclaim land might have once seemed like an easy, centuries-old solution to the housing shortage, that's no longer something worthwhile today. In the end, it was the tension between these two goals that kickstarted the changes that would shape the Netherlands into the green urban utopia it is today. See, given the country's population density, the Dutch had to avoid the same kind of urban sprawl we see in many American metropolitan areas, like the car-dependent growth of Houston or the large-scale suburban expansion of the New York metropolitan area into New Jersey and Long Island. Instead, they needed to design compact cities and concentrate development into designated growth centers, while also protecting large areas of open countryside. This was a strategy known as clustered suburbanization. Much of it involves concentrating new housing and economic growth in these designated areas, allowing for urban expansion to be carefully controlled. As a result, the Netherlands has managed to concentrate most of its population into a relatively small urban footprint. Around 70% of Dutch land is rural, and yet just 7.3% of the population lives in rural areas. But perhaps nowhere is this balance between city and nature more carefully protected than in the Green Heart. Located in the center of the Randstad, the Green Heart is a natural ecosystem covering roughly 1,800 square kilometers, filled with pastures, bogs, meadows, and farmland, and it can't be built over. The area was formalized in the 1950s to preserve nature from the expanding cities of Amsterdam, Rotterdam, The Hague, and Utrecht. To prevent these cities from merging together, Dutch planners introduced Rijksbuffer zones, which are protected buffer zones that keep urban areas separated by green space. The aim of these buffer zones were to help keep population growth near existing cities and in designated growth centers. But this made it much harder for cities to expand on their own terms. The government tightly controlled growth by putting limits on things like the height of new buildings, conserving scenic views, and using economic tools like land taxes and infrastructure subsidies to keep things in check. So after a while, it's no wonder these strict zoning laws started to feel more like shackles, preventing organic urban development. Not only were the buffer zones used to protect nature, they were also used to protect historic sites, which, to be fair, is a good thing. Amsterdam's Canal District, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, was split into a core zone and a buffer zone to protect the city's historically important areas. This effectively made the center off-limits for modern urban development. Protecting these historic homes helps preserve cultural heritage, supports sustainable reuse, and boosts local economies through tourism, though again, there's less space. As the country's urban planning system became more established, we saw another major transformation in the Netherlands' housing policy, starting from the early 1990s. But this time with very different motivations. The government began to liberalize the system, and one of their goals was to encourage home ownership. To do this, they began to lean on major tax incentives. One of the biggest incentives was the long-standing policy of mortgage interest deductibility, which allowed homeowners to subtract mortgage interest payments from their taxable income while paying off their loans. This effectively subsidized home ownership and made buying far more attractive than renting. This was great if you owned your home, but the problem was renters didn't receive the same benefits. Renters got no comparable tax advantage, even if they were living in a similar home. By the 1990s, it looked as if the system was rewarding people who owned property and offering far less support to those who rented, which was a significant policy shift from the decades before. And in a country where around 30% of the population relied on social housing, this growing imbalance quickly became a major source of tension. The transition to widespread social housing had cost the government billions, and many politicians felt it was time for these housing associations to stand on their own 2 feet. So in 1995, the government carried out a major reform known as the Grossing and Balancing Operation, or Bruteren. The government cut their funding, and they started operating as a non-profit private business with the same social mission to provide affordable housing. But this time, they were operating without any help from the government. Unlike the US, where housing is almost entirely driven by the markets, it's typical in many social democracies for these types of homes to be owned by the government. What the Dutch were trying to create here is a hybrid model. Non-profit housing operated within market-oriented principles. So, at what point did it all go wrong? Well, for a start, the number of homes being built had stalled at around 60,000 units per year by 2000, compared with 140,000 new homes that were constructed annually in the 1970s. At the same time, the country's population had grown from 10.1 million in 1950 to nearly 16 million by 2000. and as a result of rapid urbanization, more than 80% of the population now lived in well-connected urban and suburban areas. So while the Netherlands never fully privatized its housing system, it gradually stopped building enough homes to support it. And much of this can be attributed to those first few years after deregulating the system. Now, at this point, housing shortages had moved away from being just a technical issue to one of the country's most important problems. The government continued to free up regulations for the sale of housing stock, resulting in almost 25% of homes in the Randstad's 4 big cities being owned by investors. At the same time, housing construction was declining, reaching a low point in 2014 with only 45,000 homes being built. Combine that with population growth, immigration, and a rising number of international students, the country's housing shortage had quickly reached crisis levels. Then, in 2019, a court ruling forced the Netherlands to lower their emissions of nitrogen, and this immediately froze 18,000 projects, including the construction of 23,000 housing units that, to this day, have never been built. The rate of construction was already declining, and now the shortage of homes was also increasing. Perhaps nowhere was this crisis becoming more of a problem than for students. By 2022, the Netherlands was short of nearly 27,000 student beds, and many faced waiting times of up to 5 years just to secure accommodation through the shortlist providers the universities gave them. As a result, as of 2025, only 44% of Dutch students live away from home in student housing. But for international students, they had no other option but to find somewhere to rent on the private market. Speaking of rent, the average price for a student room in The Hague rose by a staggering 18.1% between 2020 and 2022. International students were now making up around 16% of the total student population, roughly 1 in 6 students. In some cities, the situation became so extreme that tents were being set up to house homeless students. And by that summer, the University of Amsterdam publicly warned incoming international students to reconsider coming if they couldn't secure housing in advance. But students weren't the only ones struggling. By 2019, 45% of the housing in the Randstad is social rental housing. But again, the demand far exceeded supply. The waiting time for a social home rose to an average of 7 years, and in some cases was even as high as 19. A part of this has to do with something the Dutch call skeerwonen, which literally translates into crooked living. It refers to those people with higher incomes choosing to remain living in subsidized social housing even after they stop qualifying. Social housing is supposed to be for single households earning less than 50,000 euros a year, with the expectation that once their incomes rise, residents move on and free up space for those who need it. But in reality, not everyone does. Some households earning far more than the qualifying amount still live in these homes while paying just 700 euros per month on rent. But is this really their fault, or is the system just designed this way? The private housing market offers few affordable alternatives, and there aren't many incentives to move, so people choose to stay in social housing, blocking access for those who need it the most. With such drastic changes happening over the past few years, it's safe to say that many Dutch residents aren't holding back their opinions. The first protests erupted back in 2021. More than 15,000 people gathered in Amsterdam, and a further 10,000 people rallied in Rotterdam a month later. And even though it's been years, people are still protesting. That brings us to the situation today. More than half of young people can't find homes to rent. Students are living in tents, and middle-class families are being priced out of the cities they grew up in. The central problem of this debate remains very much the same as it did 20 years ago. There aren't enough new homes being built, and not enough space to build them on. Today, the Netherlands now has around 410,000 fewer homes than households. In 2025, only 69,200 new homes were completed, which was far below the long-standing target of 100,000 per year. Although around 88,000 homes are expected to be built in 2026, the government has consistently failed to meet its housing targets in recent years, making this figure seem optimistic. In fact, today, there are less rental homes available in the places where people want them the most. In Amsterdam, 5,000 rental homes have been lost because private landlords are no longer owning as many properties as they used to. Many of these landlords are likely to keep selling off rental homes in 2026, which means things probably won't get better anytime soon, at least for those looking to rent. Even if investors buy new rental developments in 2026, those homes probably won't be ready for people to move into until 2027 or 2028. As I said in the beginning, Amsterdam was named the most expensive city to rent in Europe in 2025. The average rent reached 2,164 euros per month. But the crazy part is, that number is actually a 1.6% decrease compared to 2023. The problem isn't that rents briefly spiked, but that they remain structurally unaffordable. So, is the government actually going to do anything to fix it? Over the years, the Dutch have come up with some pretty creative ways to make space when there basically is none. In Amsterdam's Eiburg district, there's this neighborhood called Waterbuurt that's entirely on water. There's a cluster of approximately 93 floating homes, and these aren't your ordinary houseboats. They're actual houses. They float next to jetties and are attached to steel pylons, so the only way they move is up and down with the tide. This neighborhood is still continuing to grow today, with plans to build offices, floating gardens, and restaurants. In July 2024, the Dutch government introduced the Affordable Rent Act, which places rent caps on mid-priced rental homes. These are homes that are too expensive to qualify as social housing, but still meant to be affordable for middle-income households. Then a year later, in 2025, Amsterdam started requiring permits for tenants renting these homes. The new regulation is designed to give the city greater control over who rents these properties and at what price. Under the system, landlords are no longer able to freely choose tenants. Instead, renters must meet specific income requirements. This was partly aimed at tackling skeervonen, making sure that homes intended for those who need it are actually occupied by those who qualify. What fixing the housing crisis looks like isn't just a question for Amsterdam, but for cities across the country facing rising rents and housing costs. Whether these measures will be enough to reverse decades of housing shortages remains to be answered. Thanks for watching.